What role did the 53rd Battalion play in the Battle of Iziurava on the Kokoda Trail? We look at the tasks that they were assigned and their ability to carry them out.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 95 of the Principles of War podcast. This episode is the second in our series that looks at the 53rd Battalion and their contribution to the Kokoda Trail campaign in the Second World War. This episode is going to look at the actions of the 53rd Battalion over just 4 weeks. We're looking at 4 weeks in the life of the battalion. We're going from the 10th of August through to the 6th of September in 1942. This is the 4 weeks on which they've been judged on. This is the 4 weeks that made their reputation. And it was an incredibly tough 4 weeks for the battalion. But it was also a tough 4 weeks in the time of Maroubra Force. It was a tough 4 weeks in New Guinea Force. It was a tough 4 weeks for Australia. What I've wanted to do with this episode is to give everyone an understanding of the combat effectiveness of the 53rd Battalion. And straight up, it isn't that great. But I think it is really important to remind everyone that this series on the 53rd Battalion, it's not really about the 53rd Battalion. What we are trying to do here is to learn some lessons about raising and training battalions and getting them to the point where they can be combat effective. This is a task that, thankfully, Australia hasn't had to do very many times in its history. We needed to do it in the First World War, we needed to do it in the Second World War, and we've done it for Vietnam as well. There are many examples where this process has worked really well. We can think about Delta Company 6RAR at Long Tan. A very short period of time from raising the battalion, getting the troops in, training them up in their individual soldier skills, and getting them to be able to fight coherently as a company, and also the 1st AIF and 2nd AIF. There are many examples of well-trained battalions fighting incredibly well. This success that we've had, as well as the myth that Australians just make naturally great soldiers, means that sometimes not all of the prerequisites are put in place for success on the battlefield. And this is why I think it's important to look at the 53rd Battalion, because realistically, we don't ever want to have happen again what happened to the troops in the 53rd Battalion. I just want you to bear in mind a couple of caveats before you listen to this episode. Firstly, we need to think about the bravery of the 53rd Battalion, and I don't really think that anyone can question their bravery, and that is because the battalion was unable to function as a battalion because there'd been no training in battalion operations. There'd been no time for that. The company commanders, some of them had good experience, some of them didn't. They hadn't been given the opportunity to build those skills as leaders of companies on operations. The platoon commanders, some of them didn't have very strong experience as platoon commanders because there wasn't enough platoon commanders to go around. Now, some of them did. There were some really good lieutenants who came across from the 2nd AIF to bring up the skills within the battalion, but there wasn't enough of them, and what they had, there weren't enough resources and time to be able to instill the skills that they needed. At the soldier level, there was a fundamental lack of understanding about infantry minor tactics, how to patrol, how to navigate, how to operate your personal weapon. These troops were thrust into combat in the jungle, which I think we can all agree is the most difficult of terrains in which to conduct battalion operations. Everything is harder in the jungle. Freddie Spencer Chapman, who we came across in our Birth of the Australian Special Forces episode, he wrote the book, The Jungle is Neutral. Well, it is neutral in that it hates everyone equally. Remember, it's not just the jungle that the troops on the Kokoda Trail are operating against. They are also operating against the terrain, those steep mountains. And when you listen to the stories from the soldiers who fought on the Kokoda Trail, you find out just how oppressive the combination of the jungle and the mountains really is. So these troops operating in some of the worst terrain that Australian troops have ever operated in. Not only that, they are operating against an enemy that is battle-hardened. Many of the Japanese troops that they would be fighting had gone through their jungle training centre in Taiwan, or Formosa as it was back then. So they'd been trained for operations in the jungle. Important to remember that our jungle training centre at Canungra at this point didn't even exist. It would be another 2 months after the Battle of Isurava before the jungle training centre was initially started in November 1942. The Japanese troops have been trained for operations in the jungle. Not only that, they'd successfully conducted operations in the Malaya and Singapore campaign. Well-trained, battle-hardened, successful troops. This is the enemy that the 53rd Battalion is facing. The lads of the 53rd Battalion were going into contact with this enemy, with many of them not even having the ability to be able to change a mag on a Bren gun. We will spend a couple of episodes looking at all of the mistakes that led to the poor performance of the 53rd Battalion, because I think that there's very few mistakes that can be sheeted home to them. They are much more at the operational and strategic level. Now, with the timeline, I've tried to be as accurate as possible. There's lots of things that are going to make that very difficult. Firstly, the war diary is incomplete. There are contradictory statements are made in a lot of books and a lot of interviews. Some interviews are being given 40 years after the battle, and I think there's been a little bit of degradation of what was going on. The other thing is, in the Battle of Isurava, there is an incredible amount of fog of war, so it's very difficult to get an understanding of what companies are doing, let alone what the battalion's doing. Do have a look at the show notes. There's a link in the podcast for it. I'm going to be adding some maps because obviously the terrain is absolutely critical in this battle. So the maps will help explain it a lot better. But we're also going to put in this timeline, as well as I've got a strategic timeline as well. So the problems for the Maroubra Force commander, he's got a series of problems, but those problems are just one part of the problem when you look at New Guinea Force, and then when you look at the national level as well. There's a lot of things that are going on in the world that are impacting the decisions that are being made by and for the 53rd Battalion. Once we've gone through the timeline, then we're going to look at the factors within the battalion. Remembering, of course, that Lieutenant Colonel Ward, he is trying to do the best that he can do with what he's got. And that is the nature of military service. You need to do what you need to do, and you need to do it with what you've got. One factor that makes managing combat operations so difficult is the fact that the enemy is working aggressively to make sure that you don't have the resources and you don't have the time to achieve the mission that you've been assigned. This is a really good example of that when we look at the resources and time allocated to preparing the 53rd Battalion. Within the 53rd Battalion, within Maroubra Force, within New Guinea Force, there will be people who are making decisions based on not the best solution, but the least worst solution to the problems that they've got. What we want to be doing is looking for those unforced errors at the operational and strategic level, because they're the ones that can be fixed next time. Our story starts on the 10th of August in 1942. The battalion headquarters receives orders from the 30th Infantry Brigade, of which it's a part of, to move Bravo Company to Uberi and thence by normal stages to relieve 39th Battalion. The company is to move the very next day on the 11th. Those orders are carried to Atiki, which is where Bravo Company is conducting some training. The orders are taken by the adjutant, Captain Reid, and he leaves 30th Brigade headquarters at 2000. Those orders are issued to the OC of Bravo Company, Captain Cairns. He received those orders at 0200, so it took them 4 hours to get there. Critically, there was no warning order, so this comes as a little bit of a surprise to Captain Cairns. He's given a whole 5.5 hours to plan the move of his entire company up the Kokoda Trail, because at 0730, Bravo Company is picked up by motor transport. Trucks take them to the base kit store and all of the deficiencies in clothing and equipment are adjusted. From there, the company moves by truck to Ilola at 10:30. Now, that's not to be confused with Alola, which is much further up the Kokoda Trail. This is Ilola, just on the outskirts of Port Moresby. Lieutenant Colonel Ward inspects the companies as they move past on their way to Uberry. From there, the company moves out on foot, marching order, so they've got their packs on, and they're going to be moving up through the Kokoda Trail to relieve the 39th Battalion. Battalion headquarters also receive orders for Charlie Company to move out as well. So the 53rd has now got 2 companies that are moving out to relieve the 39th Battalion. Critically, these companies have been ordered out with very short notices to move, with no time to be able to do final training, final preparations. They're literally going to the Q store, making up some kit deficiencies. Some of them will be getting weapons for the first time without any idea of how to use them. None of this is ideal. On the 12th of August, Charlie Company 0800, they're at the base ordnance depot for the completement of their issues. They don't get a lot of time to do that. I don't know how many people are in Charlie Company, but the battalion as a whole has got 810 officers and soldiers in it. They're 65 below their establishment, so they're short 65 personnel. There's probably around 150 troops. So a couple of hours to get all of the troops off the trucks, kit issued, weapons. Some of them who'll be getting weapons like Thompson submachine guns and brain guns for the first time. That's not a lot of time to be able to do that in a couple of hours. They head out to the end of the formed road. They're there by 1000, and Lieutenant Colonel Ward and the adjutant inspect them as they're about to start marching up the Kokoda Trail. So we've now got Bravo and Charlie marching up the trail. At this time, the CO is recalled back to 30th Brigade headquarters for a conference with the brigade commander. Now, we can start to see some of the issues that are going to occur as troops are moving up the trail, because he is detained for 3.5 hours at the top of Runa Pass Road by troop movements. So the troops that are moving up the trail, and we're not even out of Port Moresby at this point. We're still on a formed road, and that detains the CO for 3.5 hours. What is it going to be like when they get up to that much worse parts of the trail? May not have been too popular by the time he actually gets to see Brigadier Porter. That's at 1700. He's then issued orders for Alpha and Don Company to move, and so they're issued with orders for the move at 2000. The CO has met Brigadier Porter at 1700. He's issued commands to the company commanders by 2000. He's only had those orders for 3 hours, so he hasn't spent a lot of time in planning out and getting those orders out, which is the right thing. You want to be using the 1/3, 2/3 rule. Spend a third of the available time doing your own planning and issuing your orders, and that gives 2/3 of the available time to your subordinates. So he's doing the right thing there. He hasn't spent a lot of time with those orders. However, I'm not sure that Brigadier Porter's providing a lot of time for a company move to occur. Let's have a look at what that compression of time looks like for a lieutenant on the ground. Here we've got an interview from the Australians at War Film Archive conducted by the University of New South Wales. This is with Lieutenant Ron Plater. So he is a lieutenant in Alpha Company. And now he is not from the 2nd AIF, but he is a recent Duntroon graduate. So a full-time Army, fully trained lieutenant. Let's see what he thinks about the current situation.
One particular night, we were unloading a ship and we were due to finish at midnight. And the officers were called together and said, "This is very confidential, you're not to mention it to the men, but we're breaking camp first thing in the morning and we're going over the Owen Stanleys to Kokoda." And we just couldn't, we weren't allowed to talk to the men about it, so the poor fellows finished their shift, went back, got back to camp and said, "Get some sleep if you can, but you've got to pack your things away. You've got to put away everything you can't take and just get anything you can carry and get ready to move at dawn." So, one of the problems was that the authorities didn't trust these young fellows. They thought they'd go AWL if they heard they were going to go into action, which could have been the case too, I suppose. But some of them anyhow. And anyway, we went by buses as far as we could, and then the road became completely bogged with the rain. We had to march virtually to the end of to the beginning of the mountains, where we struck camp for the night. And we had, I don't think there were any tents. Just had to sleep where they could. Supplies took several days to catch up with us. We didn't have any breakfast. Breakfast was a cigarette and a pea, I suppose. That was it. And then we had to go marching over the Owen Stanleys. It took us about 5 or 6 days to march. You'd go up one hill. Some engineers somehow had constructed some kind of steps in some of the hills, but often you're walking through just mud, slugging through mud. And then you had to go down the other side, which is more difficult sometimes because you're slipping and sliding in the mud. And this is hill after hill after hill. I think that it was about the third day we came to a more or less a flat area where there was a Salvation Army set up. And we had our first reasonable meal there. And the Salvation Army guys had set up there and were providing food for the troops going through. The army wasn't supplying proper food or anything.
We're now starting to get a flavour of the logistics problems that are going to plague not only the 53rd Battalion, but all of Maroubra Force up at Isurava. The 12th of August also sees the arrival of the majority of the 21st Brigade. This is an AIF brigade, and it's comprising the 2nd 14th, 2nd 16th, and the 2nd 27th. These are battle-hardened, experienced troops. Their commander, Brigadier Potts, he had arrived in Port Moresby on the 8th of August. The 13th of August sees Lieutenant Colonel Ward at Brigade Headquarters, followed by a visit to New Guinea Force Headquarters at 1100. He's doing this because he is about to commence his move, taking Battalion Headquarters up to the Kokoda area. Brigadier Porter, the commander of the 30th Brigade, is also moving off to the Kokoda area. He's now got 2 battalions that are going to be in contact, so he wants to be as close as possible to be able to effect command there. 0830, Don Company is moving out on commencing their move to Uberry. Charlie Company is off to the Q store to draw weapons and rations. They struggle finding enough rations. They also struggle finding the 8 Bren guns and magazines that they'll need up on the trail. So this is the 4th company of the 53rd Battalion's companies to be moving up the trail, and the Q store is struggling to find the Bren guns that they are entitled to. Even at this late stage, there's still equipment shortages. August 14th sees Lieutenant Colonel Ward at Uberry. He leaves there at 1000 and is able to make Iriobaiwa by 1730. The war diary says heavy climbing causes great fatigue. Battalion Headquarters under RSM Warrant Officer Yellowlee is moving with Alpha Company, and they're moving from Port Moresby to Uberry. Already we're starting to see Delta Company getting strung out across the trail. One of its platoons entered Uberry just after midnight. The rest of the company arrived at 0930. Much of the platoon had had a late start from Uberry, and that had meant that they'd had to sleep on the trail, which was cold and uncomfortable for them. Because of this, the CO issues orders for Alpha and Delta Company to rest one day at Uberry and Iriobaiwa, respectively, to enable the companies to move as a company and to ensure an early start and completion of each day's stage by the full company. The war diary goes on to say that sufficient care is not being exercised in keeping the companies together, and there is far too much straggling. Let's go back to Ron Plater, a lieutenant from Alpha Company. He's being interviewed here about the conditions on the track.
One writer might have described the terrain around Isurava as climbing stairs in a steam room or under a hose. How would you describe that terrain?
Yes, that's a good description, because there were so many mountains and valleys that you're continually climbing up stairs or paths of some description, and often sinking in mud, and it rained not every morning, but certainly every night at least it rained, and so you were never dry. And that was an extra load to carry. Trying to climb up a hill in a wet clothes is more difficult than in dry. And you had to carry your soaking pack and try to keep your weapons dry. But it wasn't, in my memory, it wasn't as tough as when you're in action, you know. It was. We managed to cope with it. Even the untrained fellows, and some that had malaria, managed to cope with it on this whole, yeah.
Can you give us an idea about what you were carrying? I know you mentioned before you were carrying the unit's cigarettes. What else was on your
Oh, you were
back?
carrying a full pack with everything you could possibly cram into it that you wanted. You had your ammunition. You had 2 or 3 pouches. You had a water bottle, ammunition wherever you could cram it. You had your. Everyone had at least one weapon. The ones that had to carry, I don't know how they carried. I've forgotten how they carried Bren guns, but that was a pretty difficult one. Needed two people to carry a Bren gun. Different parts had to be split up. It was absolute limit of what you could carry up that particular trail.
Was there anything heavier than a Bren gun? Did you have mortars or...?
Not in my experience, but they must have had to carry mortars through. They must have had mortars up there.
Another thing that we haven't talked about is how you encamped or how you slept during this time in the lead up to the actions at Ishirava.
Well, as near as possible, we stopped overnight at some place that had been formed as some kind of a camp. And sometimes there was a bit of cover. Sometimes you had to sleep in the open, or try to. I can't remember going into any native huts or anything like that, but all the locals had left the area by then. There were empty places there that people might have slept in. But usually you managed to get to a place that was designated as an overnight stop, and there was some kind of protection there for you.
What problems, apart from the weight of everything, did the rain cause and constantly being wet all the time?
Well, I don't know. It's like coming out of a swimming pool and being wet and not being able to get dry. And if you've experienced that, you get a fair idea of what it was like. Usually the heat of walking, if it wasn't raining, the heat of walking would dry your things out or dry you out to a certain extent. But on the whole, by the time evening came, rain was falling and you had to struggle through.
What about hygiene? How were you able to keep clean?
Well, there were lots of creeks. I dare say every now and then we took our clothes off and had a dip in the creek, but I can't remember particular instances. But that was possible, and especially overnight places were usually near a creek or river, and it was or a pond, and you could keep yourself, wash yourself, but you couldn't really dry yourself. That was the problem, and so a lot of people didn't go to too much bother.
The 16th of August sees all of the companies continuing to move up the trail. They receive word that the 39th Battalion is reported as withdrawing from Duniki and taking up a position forward of Ishirava. The weather is reported as cool, with a moist, heavy fog in the evening and at night, and the track as being in fair condition. Don Company arrives where the CO is at around 1700 hours. There is much struggling again apparent, and instructions are issued to keep the companies more controlled. It was on the 16th of August that Captain Geoffrey Doc Vernon met elements of the 53rd Battalion on the trail. Vernon is a legend of the Kokoda campaign. He'd served in World War I, first with the Australian Light Horse at Gallipoli, and then serving in the Middle East campaigns where he was awarded a military cross. By this time, he was over 60 years old, working as a doctor and a planter in New Guinea. However, now he was attached to ANGAU, the Australian New Guinea Administrative Unit. It was his responsibility to look after all of the native carriers' health and make sure that they were able to continue doing their work. Initially, he'd been responsible for the medical care of the troops of the 39th Battalion who'd been sent forward because there was no one else to do that. Doc Vernon had arrived at Dunedin just before the First Battle of Kokoda. He'd been ordered by the CO, Bill Owen, to stay at Dunedin with the wounded that were there. However, he ignored that order. He thought he would be more useful at Kokoda, where the battle was being fought, where the 39th would be taking casualties. He made his way to Kokoda Station, where he set up an aid post, and it was there that he treated the wounded, including Lieutenant Colonel Bill Owen, who was mortally wounded. He was one of the last ones out of Kokoda, making sure that everyone, including the wounded, were evacuated. So Doc Vernon is a seasoned campaigner, and it's interesting to see his impression of the 53rd Battalion. He wrote in his official report, "Walked to a fogey, passing the 53rd Battalion, who looked very spent going forward." He was more elaborate in his diary. "I scrambled down the hill to a fogey, meeting scores of soldiers toiling up. These were men of the 53rd Battalion, the most spent and disheartening looking of our troops I have yet seen. Yet they had to go into action shortly after having arrived at the summit." The fact that the 53rd Battalion looks a little bedraggled at this stage to Doc Vernon doesn't bode well for their future employment, which is unfortunate because they're about to be given a very important task. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor, the commander of the 39th Battalion, is also the commander of Maroubra Force, and he knows that the new commander of Maroubra Force is on his way up the trail. That's Brigadier Porter, the commander of 30th Brigade. Remember, 30th Brigade is a militia brigade. It's got the 39th, 49th and 53rd Battalions. The task that Honor has provisionally allocated to the 53rd Battalion is securing Alola and the tracks running to the east and the west. That includes out to the east Abuari and up to the north to Naroa on the west. These tasks are critical because it is part of the Japanese TTPs to look for infiltration routes. When they hit a hard surface, they're going to look to go around it. What they want to do is they want to threaten the withdrawal routes, threaten those lines of communication, which normally creates a situation where the defenders will attempt to withdraw. A withdrawal in contact is much more difficult to perform than one out of contact. The Japanese will attempt to maintain the pressure on the front whilst that withdrawal is in progress. Therefore, they'll be able to increase the number of casualties that will be inflicted on the enemy. This is why the role that is going to be allocated to the 53rd Battalion is going to be so critical. And it's interesting, the role of rear area security is a usual reserve battalion kind of role. The experience of the 53rd Battalion will highlight why well-trained and well-equipped troops are so critical in that rear area security role, particularly when you have an enemy that prefers infiltration tactics. It's also on the 16th of August that we see the first of the AIF battalions to start their move to Ishirava, and that is the 2nd 14th. 17th of August sees the CO of the 53rd, along with the 2IC, Major Hawkins, and his adjutant, Captain Reed. They leave Naro at 0700 and arrive at Fogey at 1600. We've got Bravo Company at Alola and Charlie Company at Templeton's Crossing. The War Diary makes note. Troops appear to be too heavily loaded with ammunition for this class of country. Each man is carrying 200 rounds and 1 grenade in addition to normal arms and equipment. The 18th of August sees the battalion continuing to concentrate at Alola. Alola being the village just south of Ishirava. The CO's party is moving from Afogi to Templeton's Crossing, and it's got Don Company behind it. They take lunch at Myola and arrive at Templeton's Crossing at 17:30 hours. The War Diary states, this track is in bad shape in places, and it practically straight drops into gorges. The War Diary also states, Alpha Company and Battalion Headquarters personnel moving from Naro to Afogi. Battalion headquarters personnel were found to be unfit due, no doubt, to office work and not sufficient hardening up. Here's a clip from Sergeant Keith Irwin from the Australians at War Film Archive. He is a mortar sergeant with Alpha Company. They don't have their mortars because they didn't bring them in with them, so he'll be operating as an infantry sergeant. He gives his impression of what it was like to move across the Kokoda Trail.
I don't know really how to describe the Kokoda Trail. There's been that much written about it over the years. A dreadful place is all I can say. There were parts there where it took us, you could be standing on the top of a mountain and about 400 or 500 yards away you could see the point of another mountain. To get to the other mountain it took all day to get right down to the bottom and up the other side to reach that point. A lot of the tracks we went round, you had to carry your rifle in one hand and hang on to bushes and trees to get round the sides of these mountains. Raging streams of water. You could set your clock every afternoon at the same time. Down came the heavy rain. And when I say rain, many, many inches would fall in an hour. So you were constantly wet all the time. And even if you put we had a rubber ground sheet which we used to lay on, but that was also used as a cape. So you put that round your shoulders, and being a tropical country, apart from all the rain, you were sweating so much under the cape from this rubber cape.
The 19th of August sees the CO's TAC party reach Alola, and that's where they meet Brigadier Porter and receive orders from him. Brigadier Porter then heads on to Isurava. He's got orders to take over command Maroubra Force and to deny the gap to the enemy. It's interesting to see that so far into this campaign, the mythical concept of the gap still exists, and that a commander of Maroubra Force is being given orders to deny the enemy the gap. This terrain, the gap, has been described as a place where one section with unlimited ammunition would be able to stop the Japanese advance down the Kokoda Trail because it was so narrow. It was a Thermopylae-like piece of terrain. Every commander, as a part of their appreciation of the situation, will be looking at the terrain. They're going to be looking for key terrain, which is any locality or area, the seizure or retention of which affords a marked advantage to either combatant. I would argue, though, that the gap would be decisive terrain, and that is terrain that may have an extraordinary impact on the outcome of an operation. The designation of decisive terrain implies that the success of the operation depends on the seizure or retention of the terrain. The gap is that kind of terrain. However, as we all know, there's one problem with that: it doesn't actually exist. Porter, nonetheless, has the task of denying the Japanese further advancement down the Kokoda Trail. At noon, Porter takes command from Honor of Maroubra Force. Maroubra Force at this point consists of Maroubra Force headquarters, the 39th Battalion, the 53rd Battalion, an element of Papuan Infantry Battalion, and some ORs from Angao, which sounds quite impressive. However, when you delve into the numbers, it's not as impressive as it sounds. David Coombs, in his book The Battle of Isurava, details the actual number of personnel that Porter is taking over command of. Maroubra Force headquarters consists of just 3 officers and 2 ORs. Now, I'm a big believer in small headquarters. They produce better decisions, they produce them faster. However, for a force of this size, probably too small. The 39th Battalion consists of 28 officers and 381 ORs. The 53rd Battalion has got 10 officers and 161 ORs. The 1st PIB, just 4 officers and 36 ORs, and Angao, 4 ORs. So this gives them a total of 45 officers and 584 men. That is less than 1 battalion. At this point of the battle, remembering that the 53rd Battalion has really only got one of its companies up, the 53rd Battalion makes up 22% of the officers and 27% of the ORs of the entirety of Maroubra Force. So Porter has one battalion, the 39th, that has been in sustained contact for an extended period of time and is probably close to culminating. and a completely untried battalion that is coming up of militia that he knows is relatively untrained. Just how untrained, he's about to find out. This is probably not an ideal situation for Brigadier Porter. Not only that, Maroubra Force is required to defend across a fairly large area. The 39th Battalion is at Isurava and forward along the trail to Daniki. The 53rd, as discussed, responsible for Alola and the tracks to the east and west, responsible for those line of communications and ensuring that the 39th's withdrawal route doesn't get cut off. As for the companies, Alpha Company is consolidating on Templeton's Crossing and Don Company is consolidating at Eora Creek. Guards are being placed on all camps north of Templeton's Crossing. This, no doubt, because of the danger of infiltration parties from the Japanese. One interesting note in the war diary, the Bren guns that have been issued to Don Company are travelling one day behind the company. They're being brought in by the New Guinea natives. As far as I can tell, most of the company's firepower would have been generated with the short magazine Lee Enfield 303. That's a bolt-action rifle capable of around 20 to 30 aimed shots per minute. It's a World War I weapon. It's still a great rifle. However, if a platoon gets in contact, they're going to want to generate overwhelming firepower to seize, retain and exploit the initiative, and that will be done with the Brens. It's a heavy bit of kit. The Mark 1s and Mark 2s are 10.3 kilos. Is this the reason why they were with the carriers? We've already seen that the troops were carrying an extra 200 rounds each, and those rounds are going to add up in weight. The British 303 round was an 11-gram round, so they're carrying an extra 2.2 kilos. Once again, we've got troops who may not be that well conditioned up against this terrible terrain. They're already seen by Doc Vernon and reported in the war diary to be struggling with the conditions. However, could they have brought the porters with them? Could someone have been found to carry the big heavy Brens? It's probably something that should have been done. The next day is going to be the 20th of August. Brigadier Porter has just taken command of Maroubra Force, and the 53rd Battalion is slowly concentrating at Alola. We've seen the 53rd Battalion making that hard slog into Alola. We'll come back and look at how they start to perform once they're in contact with the Japanese.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.